Alrighty, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. Really a pleasure to have you here today. My name is Andy DeSoto. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the Association for Psychological Science, APS. If you're not familiar with APS, hopefully you're a member, but if you aren't, we are an international organization dedicated to advancing psychology across disciplinary and geographic borders. If you're not a member, we'll hope you'll consider joining. I'm pleased to introduce today's webinar titled NIH-Funded Basic Experimental Studies with Humans, or BESH, Registration and Results Reporting. Before we get started, just some logistical reminders and some details. This event will be an hour. We'll be keeping attendees' cameras and microphones off during this session. So if you'd like to ask the presenters a question or make a comment, please use the question and answer feature, Q&A, at the bottom of your Zoom window. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of today's presentation. And for your reference, this event is being recorded. Now, let's get on to the topic. I'm very eager to welcome our guests from the NIH Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research and the National Library of Medicine, who are here to talk on the topic of NIH-funded basic experimental studies with humans. As you may know, the topic of NIH-funded behavioral science with humans has been controversial. It's been an important issue for APS members in the psychological science community. Several years ago, for background, NIH issued new policies that effectively broadened the definition of clinical trials research to encompass basic research with humans, and also introduced a variety of new requirements surrounding registration and results reporting that apply to much of the research that APS members conduct that's funded by NIH. If you've been following along with our Observer magazine and other places, you'll know that these changes really in a way caught our community by surprise. Since then, APS has opposed this change. Over 3,500 individual scientists have written in opposition. Dozens of current and past NIH Advisory Council members, who are NIH's top scientific advisors, have criticized aspects of these policies, and even Congress last year asked NIH to work with the scientific community to meet the needs of research subjects, scientists, and taxpayers with regard to this issue. Currently, some of the enforcements of portions of these policies have been delayed, but there continues to be some confusion around this issue, some of which I think will be addressed today. Despite this, though, a bottom line is that we are all on the same page about the importance of transparency and openness in the scientific research process, and we're really focused on conducting the best possible scientific research. And I'm so glad and thankful that OBSSR and NLM have been taking these concerns seriously and are thinking about ways to help psychological scientists register and report their research studies. And that's what we're going to be hearing about today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers very briefly so that they can get along with their presentations. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bill Riley, who is the Associate Director for Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at NIH. He heads the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research, and in this role, he coordinates and advances behavioral science research at NIH and advises NIH leadership on this research area. He's also a psychological scientist. Dr. Becky Williams is the Acting Director of Clinical Trials.gov at the National Library of Medicine at NIH. And in this role, she oversees clinicaltrials.gov, which is the database, the resource that provides patients, healthcare professionals, researchers, and the public to access to information on clinical studies. Dr. Elisa Golfanopoulos is the results team manager for clinicaltrials.gov at the National Library of Medicine. She leads the clinicaltrials.gov results review team, and she's an expert in the area of clinical trials in human subjects. She's a computational neuroscientist by training. And last, Heather Dobbins is the lead results analyst for clinicaltrials.gov. Bill, Rebecca, Elisa, and Heather, again, thank you very much for being here, and please go ahead and take it away.
Great. Andy, thank you, and thank the Association for Psychological Science for inviting us as I pull my screen up to share. So Becky or Elisa nod that you can see my screen. Good, thank you, that's helpful. I'm just going to give a brief overview of how we got to where we are before I hand it off to my colleagues at NLM to talk in a lot more detail about some of the studies that they've been doing, trying to better understand the issues related to registration and reporting of basic experimental studies involving humans. Let me just, as a preface, as Andy said, the rationale for these policies, I think we all agree with, right? The common goal of enhancing research transparency, reducing publication bias, and increase reporting of findings in a timely manner. Most of you know the research on the right. This is Ross and colleagues, but there have been many others to show that somewhere between a third and a half of the primary findings from clinical trials do not get published in a timely way. That problem extends beyond clinical trials, the typical clinical trial of safety and efficacy. About 39% of observational studies fail to get published. And in probably the lowest bar we could set, looking at some internal studies that we did that are submitted now for publication, looking at all the R01s and U01s that the NIH funds and just asking simply, is there a publication in PubMed Central associated with that grant? There's still about 2.5% of those grants that don't have a single publication associated with them in any way, shape, or form. So there's a clear problem that we have to address in terms of getting results out in a timely manner. And then there's also a commitment to research participants and taxpayers. The GAO in a report back in 2016 was very clear that the NIH needed to do a better job and be a better steward of clinical trials research moving forward and be able to monitor it better than we currently were at that time. There's clear scientific value. Most of you know most of this, so I'll jump over this pretty quickly. Minimizing publication bias, the ability to synthesize studies and do meta-analyses from a robust registration and results reporting, to limit p-hacking and hypotheses that are sort of generated after results are already known, identifying research gaps, but also facilitating study replication when necessary, aiding study recruitment and encouraging collaboration. As Andy said, given the breadth with which the definition of NIH included many experimental manipulation studies where the independent variable in a human study was being manipulated, we created this separate category within the clinical trials group for basic experimental studies with humans. They're still subject to the NIH clinical trials policies, but there were clear differences in basic and applied research that necessitated additional considerations for basic research under those policies. And so you'll see if you go to the parent funding opportunity announcements that there are specific announcements for basic experimental studies with humans. And these are studies that meet the NIH definition of a clinical trial, which you can see on the right, but also meet the definition of basic research as per the Federal Register. In terms of registration and results reporting, we pretty early in the process heard from the basic science community, not just from behavioral and social scientists, but a broader basic science community, that there needed to be some flexibilities in the requirement for prospective basic science studies to register and report. And so per the 2018 Consolidated Appropriations Act, we delayed enforcement through 2019 at that time to provide additional time for consultation and input from the community. We solicited an RFI. Becky's group will talk a bit about the RFI itself and some of the initial things that they found from that. But one thing was very clear from the RFI responses was specific challenges of some BESH studies to register and do results reporting. So as a result of that, we extended those flexibilities for basic experimental studies with humans through September the 24th of 2021. And during that time, we've been working on trying to understand some of the very specific sort of needs of the basic research community for registration and reporting, and be able to have a better understanding of how to make that system flexible enough to be able to be used for clinicaltrials.gov to be used for that purpose. In the meantime, I think it's really clear to recognize, while at this point we don't require that people register and report in clinicaltrials.gov, we do require that you still register and report. You can do that on some other open platform that's available to the public so people can see it at this time. And that's true throughout this period of time where we've got this extension and flexibility for these basic experimental studies. In case we run out of time, here's all my contact information. You're welcome to reach out to me. Most of you know me in one way, shape, or form already. So feel free to do that if you need to. But I'm going to now turn this over to Becky Williams and her team at clinicaltrials.gov to go through their details. And I need to stop sharing to do that, right, Becky? All right, thank you.
Oops. All All right, I had effectively done the sharing during our practice, and currently it is saying it is paused. All right, now it says I activated it. Sorry for that little glitch. You'd think we'd be much better at this by this point in time of the pandemic. So my goal for this talk with Elisa is really to talk about a very specific part of what NLM has been doing to support NIH with the feedback that's been received from the research community in response to those requests for information. And we'll be talking about a very specific analysis that we did, but I wanted to provide just a little bit of an overview about clinicaltrials.gov and our model first, as it really forms the basis for our analysis. I also wanted to mention, although I'm not talking about it today, is that Bill's office has been a really excellent partner, and we have been working with them to develop additional case studies and examples that are more specific to the behavioral research community that may help better support understanding how to register and report results for certain types of study designs that are common among behavioral researchers. And so I'd say stay tuned for that. We're expecting that to be available in the fall, and we expect to do a webinar again when those resources are available. But what I'll be talking about today is a very specific analysis that we did to really try to understand the feedback from the community. And just as background, the NIH policy for registration and results reporting sort of generally leverages the already existing model that's been available at clinicaltrials.gov. And that model really focuses on 3 stages of the study: before you actually initiate the study, while the study is ongoing, and then completion. That the expectation is that the study be registered at initiation, that the information be kept up to date throughout the life cycle, and then at the end of the study, the results be submitted to the results database. And our model has always had some key assumptions to it. And one is that traditionally the concept has been that there's one protocol, and that typically corresponds to one clinical trial, and that then corresponds to one study record. And that's really been sort of the foundation for the content that gets registered, with the protocol being the pre-specified approach that's going to be followed for trial conduct. We have other recent examples that sort of, again, challenge this model. Master protocols are another sort of new development, adaptive study designs that have really required some consideration how to best be reported within this general assumption and the model. The registration information that's provided before study initiation is a brief description of how the study will be carried out, summarizing the study design, what the arms and interventions are, eligibility criteria, etc., with a focus too on the primary and secondary outcomes that will be evaluated and then reported on after the study is complete. Similarly, the results information is completed after study completion. It's summary information. This is not individual participant level data. This is summary level data provided in a tabular format. And the system right now does not accommodate figures, images, conclusions, or narrative text. And so what you typically see is that when an outcome measure is represented in a publication, it may be a combination of narrative text, descriptive text, or the figure. But in general, this can always mostly always be translated into a tabular format representing that outcome measure. In this case, they were looking at different measurements associated with response, with definitions for those different levels of response. And the concept for an outcome measure really relies on this framework that we had presented a while back, but really comes from characterizing the results information that's been made available through clinicaltrials.gov, in that when you're specifying an outcome measure, the highest level of information is that anxiety, that in this case anxiety, that you're sort of specifying the domain. That would be the highest level. But then typically, if you're going to be assessing that particular domain, you have a specific measurement, and there's lots of different measurements you could use for any one outcome measure. And then accordingly, you would choose to summarize any particular changes you're seeing in your population using a specific metric with a specific method of aggregation. And so that's also sort of the framework that we rely on for reporting of results information. And to a certain extent, the registration information parallels that outcome measure framework. But as we're all sort of familiar with, there's really a range of interventional studies with humans, and I'm just going to reflect on this for a quick minute, and we'll come back to it later. But there's really sort of this spectrum in which studies can potentially be classified. You're first, having to make this distinction: is the study interventional or observational? And then once you've made that distinction, there's sort of a range in terms of what might be considered basic and what might be considered applied. And when it switches from basic to applied, I think is a little bit of the gray area where we're all sort of grappling with. And similarly, you have the concept of exploratory and confirmatory. And again, sort of when does that transition occur, and what does that particularly mean? And from our experience, it really seems like the studies that we're now referring to as BESH, seem to cross sort of this spectrum that you see here. And we'll carry this concept forward in a little bit. I'll come back to it. But as I mentioned, we've really been trying to rely on the key information sources that the research community has used to provide NIH with information. There was the request for information back in August of 2018, and in general, there was general agreement on the importance of transparency. But when it came to the details, that's where it got a little trickier. And so what I'm highlighting here are basically the study types and aspects that researchers found most challenging when considering how to register and report on clinicaltrials.gov. We did conduct sort of a preliminary analysis early last year in which we tried to evaluate the issues raised by the RFI commenters. We were primarily relying on the published literature for this analysis, and so it did have some limitations, but some of this early work was summarized in an open mic blog that appeared back in July of 2019 that was co-authored by Bill as well. And so what we aimed to do was to really extend that preliminary analysis to include evaluation of protocol documents, because those obviously are the foundation for what would be reported in a registration system, and to also validate as much as we could our findings and our interpretations with researchers themselves. And so in the course of this analysis, we looked at 12 case studies. We did start with our intramural program first because they were easily accessible and sort of willing partners in this work. You will be not surprised to hear that many of sort of the views and experience of intramural and extramural PIs actually aren't that much different. And then we expanded to include some extramural PIs as well. We found a significant amount of overlap, and really it seemed like we had a sufficient sample to be able to form our conclusions. As I stated, we did try to use protocol documents when we could, and we had our staff evaluate those documents and assess whether our study model could accommodate these BESH studies. And then we had further discussions about our findings and issues with the investigators themselves. And you'll see here just sort of the breakdown in terms of what their experience was. Some did not actually even have any direct experience with providing information to clinicaltrials.gov. At NIH, there's sort of a service that supports investigators with that registration process. And none of the investigators had any experience on both sides with result submission via the system as well. Few of the intramural community used other platforms, but when looking at the extramural community, most of them had experience in using other platforms, mainly OSF. And on both sides of the spectrum, there was some confusion about BESH dissemination and data sharing policies. Particularly, there's some confusion too about the relationship to individual participant level data sharing policies. And so on the next few slides, I just have this for reference. I'm not going to read it. You can see sort of some of the keywords highlighted in red, but these are the 12 case studies that made up our analysis. And then Elisa will be picking a few of these to give you some greater insights into that work. Ultimately, we found that our findings did validate the preliminary analysis. It did give us deeper insights, and it allowed us to really consider some emerging points for registering and reporting results, particularly of exploratory BESH. And in terms of what those challenges were, and again, these will be better illustrated as Elisa goes through some of the case studies. The first is really multiple interrelated experiments. A lot of the research that we are looking at, wasn't simply one study with one clear beginning and one clear end. It was sort of a collection of experiments that led to being able to draw conclusions about a particular area of research. And sort of along those lines, there was an absence in the protocol documents of detailed pre-specified primary outcome measures that would sort of follow that framework that I described early on. And we found that many BESH studies, were exploratory and were sometimes even exploring measures that might be useful for formulating a model. And then we also saw that a lot of the results were sometimes presented as individual participant data and didn't necessarily follow that profile for summary results information that we expect. And then again, a little bit similar to the first point, many of the studies were sort of iterative and exploratory, and so may involve sort of the development of new methods that may have been difficult to pre-specify at the beginning, as well as the final challenge was use of non-tabular formats. We hadn't mentioned this one earlier in the Open Mic blog, but it did become more of an issue in that it appeared that much of the data that was being presented in some of our case studies involved graphical data, images, and qualitative information rather than easily translating to some of the tabular formats we rely on. And so again, kind of coming back to that earlier graphic that was showing sort of the spectrum, that you can see that the studies that had the most challenges are sort of on that bottom left side, and the ones that are, very consistent with the model at clinicaltrials.gov align with that upper right-hand side. So again, sort of the spectrum of research aligns with sort of the spectrum of how well things are accommodated in clinicaltrials.gov with the current model. And so with that, I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it over to my colleague, Elisa, who can provide some more information on some of the case studies that were included in our sample to better illustrate some of those challenges I just described.
Thanks, Becky, and thank you, Andy, for that nice introduction. I am suddenly having, okay, excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Becky said, I will be providing a few examples from our analysis. Unfortunately, we won't be able to go through all the case studies today due to certain time constraints that we have, but those that we have selected have characteristics common of BESH and would pose challenges for registration and results reporting. One characteristic that's common of BESH is that often multiple experiments will be proposed under a single protocol. These types of protocols pose the challenge of how to best represent all the different experiments and their results in a way that would be scientifically meaningful and useful. This is one of the primary challenges for the protocol of case study number 3. At its inception in 1993, it was one of the first fMRI protocols proposing around 10 different experiments. As results were discovered, amendments were made, and the protocol grew in size to its present version, including over 50 different experiments organized according to 7 different themes. After over 20 years, questions continue to be formulated from those discoveries that are made, and they take a very methodical and albeit self-perpetuating approach to generating a protocol. This study that was published in association with the protocol demonstrates the level of complexity that any one experiment can have. Developed by combining the methods of 3 different experiments proposed within the perception theme, a new experiment was derived that involved 3 different neuroimaging sessions per participant. Behavioral performance and neural activity was recorded across all 3 neuroimaging sessions to understand the functional specialization of visual brain areas. So this study represents just one of the combinatorial set that can stem across themes and from the 66 different experiments. The magnitude of this protocol underscores the challenge. For protocols with multiple interrelated studies, we might ask, what should the unit of reporting be? Should it be at the level of the research program, describing over 50 different experiments and nearly 200 outcome measures, at the level of the theme, even though experiments can be combined across themes, or at the level of the experiment, resulting in over 50 different experiments, 50 different public records for a single protocol. Certain BESH protocols only provide high-level objectives that broadly convey what will be studied, the instruments that will be used for measurement, the interventions assigned to participants, and importantly, do not restrict the outcome measures at the outset. These types of protocols pose a challenge in terms of offering sufficient detail for a registration to be scientifically meaningful and useful. This is the primary challenge for the protocol of case study number 6. The overarching exploratory objective was to study how IgE-mediated food allergy develops, and a variety of assessments were described at a high level in the protocol. At the point of publication, however, the study design and the outcome measures are very specific. The study involved children with and without peanut allergy, and the authors performed specific measurements to quantify and phenotype peanut-specific T cells. Notably, these assessments hadn't been documented in the protocol. For protocols with a high degree of flexibility, we might ask, from where should the level of detail be drawn for a scientifically meaningful and useful registration? The approach of this next protocol is somewhat of a hybrid of the ones that we just saw. The primary objective of the protocol for case study number 1 was to provide standard care therapy for drug-resistant epilepsy. A secondary goal was to explore the neurophysiological correlates of cognitive processes. Towards this end, several small experiments were proposed involving cognitive and motor tasks that were only broadly defined. This study, published to address one of the secondary goals, involved intracranial recordings and while participants performed a verbal episodic memory task. The measures assessed the role of ripples or fast oscillatory activity in memory retrieval. These assessments had not been described in the protocol. So in addition to having multiple interrelated studies and the absence of pre-specified outcome measures in the protocol, case study number 1 demonstrates another common characteristic of BESH, a need for tabular, non-tabular formats and participant level data. This figure on the right illustrates the degree of similarity in the pattern of activity across all electrodes during the encoding and retrieval periods of correct and incorrect trial performance. The temporal region of interest on the right, I'm not sure if you can see it, hopefully you can see it, I can't see it on my screen, all the way on the right there, is unique to this study, and reporting results from it would not be as scientifically meaningful or useful without the graphic that depicts its temporal location. Likewise, the publication included the results of each individual participant because, as you can see in this figure, the placement of electrodes differed across participants. So these participant level data actually capture distinct information that cannot be conveyed with the group level data. Non-tabular formats like figures and individual participant level data pose the challenge of how they could be reported in a system that expects tabulated data and group level information. Certain BESH involve piloting to develop or optimize parameters or procedures. The protocols associated with these BESH are more flexible to accommodate iterative preliminary studies. These types of protocols pose the challenge of how to capture the research program's evolution in a way that would be scientifically meaningful and useful. This challenge is apparent for the protocol of case study number 4. The overarching goal of the protocol was to explore different stimulation parameters. Information emerging from these experiments could lead to optimized procedures for hypothesis-driven research. Preliminary pilot studies are rarely captured in publication. However, we were given a copy of the continuing review document within which one of the pilot studies was described. The goal of this pilot was to examine brain areas involved in modification of existing motor memories. The results informed the design of a hypothesis-driven experiment related to motor learning and rehabilitation in stroke patients. The flexible nature of this protocol allowed for the development of a version of the experiment where a hypothesis could be tested. For protocols like these, we might ask, at what time point should registration and results reporting take place so that summary information about the study design and results are scientifically meaningful and useful? At this point, I will turn the presentation back over to Becky. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Elisa, for that summary. Here we go. Somehow it put me in the wrong place. So what was really interesting about the case studies that we were able to look at and that the team was able to really dive into and try to understand what was being conducted in the research is that it really gave us some insight into issues that need to be considered in any registration and results reporting model. We did want to first share some of the more qualitative information, though, that we also received from investigators since we had the opportunity to discuss with them directly their research and to validate sort of how we were characterizing and summarizing it. There's sort of two sides. Overall, investigators did believe that there were some benefits to having a registration and results system. The main things we're really thinking about the value in having a central database by which you might be able to locate other similar research. By basically having information aggregated in one place with a strong search engine on top of it, it really does afford some benefits, including promoting research collaboration, ideally mitigating duplication of effort, and really providing a framework for being able to track and monitor different programs of research and to help manage some of those portfolios. And then, as Bill was referring back to earlier, there's real opportunities to really promote and enhance scientific rigor when it's accompanied by a very transparent process for reporting. People offered specific suggestions for implementation that we documented as well. The theme that you see here is really thinking about how can you leverage other existing things that may occur while also offering flexibility. You can see this slide has a lot more words on it. It sort of reflects the investigators' views as it relates to challenges. Again, everyone was supportive of transparency, but had some overall concerns about how to approach implementation, and really reflected on some of the challenges that we had found in our own analysis, particularly when trying to disseminate BESH that might be more exploratory and applying this, model that was traditionally founded in the applied research space. They also felt that the model might be burdensome, given the large number of experiments that we saw, large amounts of data, with multiple assessments over long periods of time. So clearly a concern about sort of the relationship to the value versus the time spent, and really focused on sort of the fact that they viewed exploratory BESH as being distinct from applied clinical trials, and some of the definitional aspects associated with that, as well as sort of the purposes of that research overall. And so when we thought a little bit about sort of the analysis itself, as well as the challenges, and then the different views that we've heard from investigators, we've been able to kind of summarize things into how we might define different factors that must be considered in any model for registration and results reporting. There's sort of two major categories here. One is what I'm calling the unit of reporting, and I'll explain that a little bit more. The second major category is, of course, continuing to be clear about definitions when possible. But the unit of reporting is really so important when you reflect back on that earlier case study that Elisa had shown that, was really a program of research over 20 years. And so how do you define the appropriate unit to be registered and then to have results reported? And that unit is so important because everything you see under it really flows in terms of how you might decide what appropriate timing and due dates are, what that minimum required content looks like, what the format for that content should be, as well as any quality control review process you might apply to that information and content. I'm not going to go into detail into the sub-bullets, but I just wanted to further clarify sort of this concept of unit of reporting. And it's really a way just to abstract out some of the things that Elisa was describing in the case studies themselves. Sort of what we observed overall, and it's different for every type of study we looked at, was that there was often a research program, something broader that describes sort of the largest unit that might be described in a research protocol. And it may not necessarily list individual experiments, but would instead list what might be the overall objectives of the research program itself. Then within a research program, you may have projects, or you may have experiments, or you may have both projects and experiments, where a project is really sort of a cluster of experiments. And again, from what we observe, these may or may not be described in the protocol, and the individual experiments may or may not currently be described in the protocol, but would be commonly reported in articles. So a lot of the reporting is really happening after the conduct of the experiment, and a lot of the documentation is happening either alongside the experiment or after the experiment rather than before. And then finally, the experiment itself, is the smallest unit, and it could be, any type of experiment. It could be considered exploratory or confirmatory, and again, is often reported in articles. But usually when we're looking at published articles, it seemed that these experiments tend to be clustered and reported together, often as projects that more directly describe sort of an area of exploration and research. And so again, sort of back to this slide, you can see why that unit of reporting becomes so important in terms of when you're designing a system and how you might approach sort of going about that in the process, and how to best accommodate the nature of BESH. And so I'd like to just quickly acknowledge, you saw Heather Dobbins is on this call and you heard from Elisa, but there's been a broader team of people that have been supporting this analysis on my team. And so I really thank them for their detailed work in this space. We do hope to more broadly be able to disseminate sort of these findings. And again, they are intended to sort of further support NIH as we're continuing to respond to the concerns raised by the community. And this has really been a great opportunity for us to be able to share with you sort of things that aren't always visible to the external community and how we might be approaching looking at some of the concerns and challenges you raise. So we're really happy to have the opportunity to sort of share our preliminary results from this analysis with this group. And we thank you for hosting us. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And I know we have some time to address questions that folks might have had.
Yes, and as a reminder, folks should feel free to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit a question for our presenters. I can go ahead and start with the first question, if you don't mind, which is just sort of from the data that you showed. It does sound like there are lots of challenges remaining for fitting behavioral research with humans into the clinical trials sort of mold. Can you speak to what might be next following the results that you just presented to us?
Yeah, that's obviously the next best question, and the one I wish I had sort of the best answer to. I think that, you know, our research and this analysis has really given us the opportunity to have much greater insights into the types of things and the reasons that people will be facing challenges and the things that would have to be addressed in those next steps. And we're currently sort of evaluating what that could look like.
Can I just add, Andy, I think, you know, the team at NLM has focused appropriately on I don't know if I'd necessarily call them exceptions, but the challenges and the difficulties in BESH reporting. But my sense is that it's still the case that the vast majority of BESH reporting can be done via clinicaltrials.gov without some of these specific sort of challenges that Becky and her team have noted. So those who can at this point, I think it's certainly reasonable to continue to do it that way as we try to figure out how to address the challenges that we've identified through this process. I also wanted to just do a quick shout out to Becky's team. They focused on the analyses that they did in this sort of second phase. The phase that they didn't talk a lot about is the one in which they actually, based on the RFI, looked at people who responded to the RFI, looked at their publications, went through those publications in detail, and tried themselves to register some of those studies. And it was in the process of doing that that they began to identify some of these key things that subsequently led to the study. So it's been a long and multi-stage effort, almost one of those iterative exploratory processes we were talking about.
We should have registered our analysis.
We really should have, but anyway, yes.
So a follow-up question then, while we wait for questions to come in, is just, I can imagine if I am an early career scientist, for example, trying to get my start conducting NIH-funded basic research with humans, some of the complications you just described seem pretty overwhelming, and I think it would be really hard to kind of wrap my head around the right way to register and report, and I would be worried about potentially being penalized, for instance, for getting something incorrect. Kind of in this murky in-between period, is there a resource that I can turn to learn how to most appropriately register and report my work in these cases of these exceptions, perhaps?
Yeah, so I can start with some of the resources we have at NLM, and that probably should have been my last slide, so we'll make sure you have those documented as follow-up as well. We have, over the last year, launched sort of what we have a document that's sort of our PRS guided tutorials that basically is a step-to-step guide for how to submit both registration and results information using the submission system if you're not already familiar with it. So it's like screenshots of every screen, and we've then been fitting in issues that are unique to specific types of study designs. So the ones that we have available right now are more focused on sort of the more traditional designs that folks are familiar with. As I forecasted, we do expect to have some additional resources available with study designs that are more specific to the behavioral research community in the fall. And so that will be another resource sort of interdigitated again with sort of that guided tutorial to call attention to those special cases. And then finally, if anyone has any question, any trouble at all, we have a very responsive customer service desk. That email address, and again, we'll follow up with this, is register, as in I'm going to register a study, register@clinicaltrials.gov. And so it's a easy way to request help if you want some more one-on-one assistance with figuring out how to approach that registration or results submission process. And we're very happy to help on a case-by-case basis as well.
Thank you very much. We have a few additional questions that are coming in that I'll just go ahead and share with you. One is, it seems as though this proposed BESH approach to registration maps onto what's included in an NIH application already. Are there plans to integrate the registration process into the grant submission or just-in-time process rather than create another administrative step for investigators?
Yeah, I'll speak generally to this, and then I think, I don't know if Bill might have more to add, but that does sort of reflect, feedback that we heard from investigators themselves, where they're really looking for opportunities to leverage existing processes or documentation that's already in place. I would say that sort of the goal is not to have this be an administrative process, but this is really to support the scientific enterprise. And the goal is for it to be scientifically meaningful and useful. And so that's a driving principle for how we're looking at this as well, to ensure that it's also meeting that standard without sort of being overly burdensome. And so I would say that there's lots of opportunities to look at all these other existing processes and where that information may be sufficient and where it might not meet that scientifically meaningful and useful standard.
What I'll add to that is that, those of you who have done the either clinical trials or BESH more structured grant application process, you'll see that a lot of those fields that you complete in that grant application process map almost one-to-one to the fields in clinicaltrials.gov registration. The goal at the point that those were being built and trying to map those together was, so at some point in the future, we're not there yet, we might be able to map those such that we could just transfer that data from your grant application, should it be funded, into the fields of clinicaltrials.gov, and then you would just need to sort of curate, check it, validate it, make sure it's all correct based on where you currently are. So that's the possibility down the road as well.
Thank you. We have one question that's a bit of a question of concern, maybe good for you, Bill, to answer, is especially given the results of this helpful review, wouldn't it have been nice if perhaps NIH had conducted this research before implementing some of these changes? The comment is reflecting on early in career investigators who've had grants withdrawn or harm that's been done to the careers of younger folks. Is that on folks' mind currently as we navigate through some of this? And is there anything that can be done about people who are potentially being harmed by some of the confusion around these current policies?
Yeah. I mean, certainly, let me at least briefly address the administrative withdrawal process. Another group separate from Becky's is looking in detail at trying to clarify better this line between what is and what is not an observational study versus a more interventional study. As you might imagine, that line is not particularly clear, and some people have assumed quite appropriately that they thought they were doing a more observational trial, and our receipt and referral folks said, no, you really should have come in under this. We've done the same sort of, let's step back as the NIH, for right now, accept what is sort of a good faith effort on the part of the investigator to define what they think their study is, And until we begin to kind of work out better details of exactly what is and what is not a BESH or a clinical trial in terms of which one of those you should be submitting under versus a clinical trial optional, more observational study. So we're still working on that issue as well. There are a number of program officers within the NIH who are trying to sort through some of those details and provide additional clarity on that so that we don't have these administrative withdrawals happening as part of the process.
Thank you very much. Continuing to go through our questions. Here's a question that talks about how, unfortunately, in psychological science, that there's a history, maybe a history of harm being done to groups such as those from African descent. And the question is just, are these policies, do they have the protection of groups like this in mind? And can you speak to the ways that that these policies might help protect vulnerable populations?
Becky may have some other specifics related to Trials.gov. I'll just note that particularly given the current social unrest that we're in, the NIH has been taking very seriously a look at a number of factors having to do with our rate of success of African-American investigators, of racism and health type of research that we do, and a number of those other factors, and trying to come up with a better plan for how we address some of those issues moving forward than we've done thus far. In terms of protection and that sort of thing, I think we've often seen the sort of registration and reporting part as being separate from the IRB approval process, and those sorts of things having to do with protection of human subjects. They're not totally distinct from one another, but they're related. But I certainly think one of the things that's important about registration and reporting is that it, at least for me, it values every person who's a participant more than it would if you didn't do that, right? It ensures that something is going to be done with their data in some meaningful way as a result of the fact that they participated as a human participant in our studies. Becky, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think your last point is really important, and it sort of again reflects on the fact of, you could use a phrase like secret human experimentation. That sort of the whole goal of transparent reporting is to ensure that there's a mechanism for people to be aware of research that's being conducted. And I think that in itself is a very important foundation for being able to understand some of these concerns. I would just also, more from a pragmatic point of view, the clinical trials registry, we aren't the deciders of sort of what research is good or qualified or otherwise. So long as they're sort of meeting the minimum requirements for reporting, we're a repository to make that information available. So we don't have, unfortunately, the luxury of making decisions about which trials are sort of good and bad, if you will. But we really allow sort of the wider scientific community the opportunity to do so and rely on many of the protections that are in place within our current system. We also do reinforce some reporting aspects that when results are required to be reported, one of the required pieces of information that must be provided as part of baseline characteristics is the race and ethnicity of the research participants if it was collected. Also, sex of research participants must be provided as well. So those are two additional ways to get insight into who is being included in that research after it's been completed.
Thank you. Do you have plans to collect any more data, any more case studies in this area?
I think that based on the group that we found, once we sort of hit once we even expanded to the extramural community, we were really sort of reinforcing our earlier findings. We weren't really finding new issues. And so I think it would take basically, sort of understanding if there's new issues that don't sort of fit into the challenges or categories that we've described. I'll just reinforce that sort of the ones I presented today are what we consider primary challenges. These are sort of the most important challenges. There are a number of secondary secondary challenges. And many of the things that are in that secondary challenge category actually are not totally unique to BESH. They actually have some broader applications to other types of study models that may be new or evolving or that have existed for a while. And so they're not necessarily, unique to this particular area of research, but still do require attention.
Thank you. And then maybe time for one or two more questions. We've gotten some great ones in. So what we'll try to do is share these questions, certainly at the end, with our NIH colleagues so that they're aware of some of the things that are being asked. One question is, how should behavioral scientists handle registration of studies on clinicaltrials.gov when it's important that participants not know whether they're in a control group or the nature of the intervention, for instance, which might be the case in social psychological science studies, for instance. The question asker offers stereotype threat manipulation, for instance, where older participants might be asked to read an article about memory decline and aging being inevitable or being well maintained and seeing how that affects performance. They note the current setup in clinicaltrials.gov requires a description of the intervention and control condition, which could change participants' performance if they happen to read it beforehand. These kinds of stereotype threat studies, for instance, as well as other behavioral studies.
Yeah, that's an issue that we have certainly seen before, and sort of our informal, advice at this point is, in terms of what you would include in the registration record itself, try to align that with what you had informed the participant of in the informed consent document, that sort of level of detail would be appropriate for the initial registration. And then after the study conduct has been done, you could update the study record to more accurately or more specifically, I guess, represent what that study design looked like. Because again, sort of the goal of registration is not to undermine sort of the scientific integrity of the research itself. And so there are certainly specific case studies like that you sort of have to address in a little bit different manner than traditionally.
Well, thank you. Given that it's about 3 o'clock here in Eastern time, it's a good time to wrap up this event. I'd like to thank our presenters for being here to talk about these issues today. Thank you also to our audience and as well as my colleagues at APS who have helped organize this. To our audience, please feel free to send me any input on things that you'd like to hear covered in future APS webinars. You can write us at aps@psychologicalscience.org or respond to some of the emails you've been getting from us. But again, thank you so much to our presenters, and I hope everyone here has a really good rest of the day. Thank you all.
Thank you, Andy.
Great, thank you.